Might as well just get right into
Yeah,
it.
I think we can start rolling.
Yeah.
Okay, we are recording.
Awesome. Well, welcome everyone. Nice to see everyone's faces and waving. Yeah, it's great to see everyone. I hope February has been an interesting month for you. I have to tell my wife to pick up the kids. Tracy, kids are ready. Zoom life. But no, I think for me, February has been kind of quite interesting because finances are something, I don't know, I'm not super passionate about. So I like to kind of just put my money in a bank and not even think about it. And, you know, our SPs or our ESPs, whatever, just sign up and go. And this has really made me reflect on it. And that little chart that hopefully Patrick shows at some point in his talk is pretty mind-boggling, how the footprint of our investments can be way bigger than our personal footprints. And yeah, it's kind of been fun. So today I had my meeting with CIBC, and from our research there, it doesn't look great. And it was awesome when I sent her the letter, the manager the letter. Right away, she got back to me, and she was super open-minded and kind of like interested in it because she didn't know about it either. So it was really just kind of opening her mind to this idea that things can be done differently, and she's going to write her managers and get her whole team together and talk about it. And I think that's, you know, it's awesome that we've got like Van City and these options to go to, but it's also neat that like that letter can start changing CIBC, because we know that they're not that great. And we'll see where it goes, but she's definitely going to bug her managers and everything else. So that was definitely exciting, because I was like, oh God, here we go. I got to go in and meet my bank. And yeah, it's just, to me, what I realized is that, yeah, it's totally worth it. Even just starting that little conversation amongst the office there makes them start thinking about it. And a lot of this is really that tipping point, is us having this conversation, you guys learning more, you guys going and having conversations with your friends. It's just these kind of the little ripple effects that just start spreading. And really, it's that tipping point we're looking for. And these conversations are so awesome to have, because everyone is just a little bit more feeding into the changing of the mindset, and then ideally we just can create a better future. So yeah, sorry, Trevor was just saying having no money makes investing decisions easy. That is true. But no, I was looking at our reflections, and there's tons of great reflections from people over last month, because I think that carbon footprint was definitely interesting for people, and all the education components. And that education is really important, because we're talking about, if you help convince people, you got to be educated. So hopefully some of those articles really have helped you in those conversations, and those awkward ones where all of a sudden somebody questions you about it and you're like, oh wait, I actually know something. But yeah, let's just keep the conversation going, because it's all about just spreading that mindset till eventually we all switch to it. Before we get too far, there's the reflection from last month. Sean Barrett won the prize, and what's neat about the prize is that it's a $500 Arc'teryx gift, but it's for a local store. So wherever that person lives, Sean can go and take it and buy locally, which kind of fits in February, because local's great. We all want to support our neighbors, right? So in that respect, the prize is awesome. I personally do pretty well with local, but quite often I get stuck in my mindset where I'm going straight to Save On instead of going to a couple of local stores. And I do try to make sure most things are BC. And but I did realize today, as I was buying my apples and rushing to get back here to do this, that the apples I bought are from Chile. So I'm obviously not perfect. And I think that we just have to always remind ourselves that we're just trying, and we're trying to be better. Because yeah, I'm not gonna tear myself apart when I watch my kids eat the apples from Chile. I'm just gonna think, okay, next time make sure they're from BC. But yeah, so I don't have a lot to talk about so far, because for me, finances, like I said, I went to CIBC and I learned a bunch, and I'm gonna bug credit union where I have my mortgage and just kind of keep exploring. But really, these Zoom meetings are to bring in the experts, and we brought in Patrick Derochie, and he's going to talk about pension funds and how to kind of put our money in the right places, because you start looking at his resume, and he's got a ton of experience. But one of the things he works for is Shift, and it's a pension engagement small nonprofit that tracks the fossil fuel investments. So he's got a huge wealth of knowledge that he's going to share with us. And what we're going to do is, after his talk, which is about 30 minutes, we'll do a Q&A from him, and also just have a bit of a conversation on how the challenge is going and that sort of stuff. So without further ado, we'll let Patrick take over and educate us a bit. So cheers. let's hear
Thanks
it.
a lot, Greg, for the intro. I'm just going to share my screen with everyone so you can see my presentation. Figure out how to share my slides. Here we go. Okay. Yeah, thanks for having me tonight. I'm going to try and, this is usually like a 45-minute workshop to an hour, but I'm going to try to cram it down into a half hour. So apologize if I'm speaking a little bit fast. And I'm hoping to a good Q&A and discussion at the end so we can talk about this issue more. So just to start a bit of an outline, I'm going to go over a little bit of information about the climate crisis and how it relates to finances. I'm going to talk about the financial risks and opportunities of climate change. I'm going to talk about kind of like the fundamental reshaping of the financial world that's happening right now. We're seeing this massive move away from investments in fossil fuels into clean technology and renewables. I'm going to do a bit of a deep dive into the Canada pension plan, since most folks here, as long as you don't live in Quebec, are members of that pension funds. I'm also going to talk a little bit about some Canada's fossil fuel big five banks to pick up on what Greg was talking about. And then hopefully we got some time for some Q&A discussion afterwards. I'm happy to stay a little bit past the hour to talk more if folks want to. And yeah, we'll dive right in. So just some basics on the climate crisis. I'm sure you all know this, but I just want to frame this conversation. This is the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere over the last 60 years, constantly going up to dangerous levels, completely in concert with the increase of production and combustion of oil, gas, and coal. This is well established, it's scientific consensus, it's happening, and we're seeing the impacts now. This is the temperature change that we've seen over the same time period. And in the last 10 years, 9 of those years have been the warmest on record, and this is expected to get worse, and this warming trend and extreme weather trend is going to accelerate. A few local examples of those kind of impacts we're already seeing because of this increased amount of heat in the atmosphere. On the top left, we have the wildfires we're seeing in BC and across the West Coast more frequently. I'll talk a bit about the Fort Mac fire on the next slide in Alberta. Down at the bottom left, in Ottawa, I don't know if folks have been to Ottawa or have lived there, but I used to live there, and I used to love it how I used to be able to skate to school and work in the morning. But this winter, despite Ottawa's normally frigid climate, the canal just opened last week. So they're seeing those kind of impacts in their recreation as well. Up on the top right here, you're seeing Ontario's ski season. Not that it really amounts to anything compared to BC and Alberta, but the ski hills we do have here are struggling to stay open, even in good years that aren't COVID years, because it's just not cold enough anymore. We're not getting enough snow. And then on the bottom right, that's the Columbia Glacier, which is kind of like the drinking fountain for all of the prairie provinces of Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba. And unfortunately, it's melting, and it's going to cause a lot of droughts, heat waves, and water shortages in the future in the prairie provinces. So those are just a few kind of localized examples across Canada of how we're seeing these impacts already. And we need to stop putting fossil fuels in the atmosphere in order to try to mitigate these impacts. So this is just the economic elements of those impacts. These are the insurance losses from natural disasters we're seeing. So increased floods, wildfires, droughts, heat waves, storms, it's starting to add up. And as you can see, it's on an upward trend. There's a big spike there because of the Fort Mac fire, which destroyed 10% of the town back in 2016. There's a big spike in 2013. Those were the floods in Calgary and Toronto that caused a lot of damage. And just keep in mind that these are only insured losses. So we're not even talking about all the economic damages that aren't insured and that the government or individuals end up having to pay for. But this is just kind of to get across the trend of these increasing economic costs to society because of climate change and its impacts. I want to show this graph because it shows the trajectory of emissions we need to be on in order to maintain a safe climate, in order to maintain that 1.5 degrees Celsius of increased warming that the Paris Agreement says we need to, in order to avoid an absolute catastrophe. So if you kind of start back in 2000, when we had a bit more time, that slope of downward greenhouse gas emissions was a bit softer. But instead of doing that and listening to the science, we stepped on the gas instead. So now we're way up here. And this is the trajectory we need to be on in order to maintain that safe climate. It's almost directly down. There's no room for increased fossil fuel production. We need to immediately transform our society and our economic system, our energy systems, in order to avoid the worst impacts of climate change. And we got to do it in 10 years. So that really downward trend line is where we are now. And I just want to really point that out because this is about finance. And when we're talking about financing companies and new projects, they're designed to operate for 30, 40, 50 years. So we need to make decisions now with our money to prevent those projects from getting built and those companies from growing their fossil fuel infrastructure. I'm going to dive right into the different financial risks associated with climate change. So there's physical risk, transition risk, regulatory and legal risk, and then portfolio risk or systemic risk. I'll go over a bit with each of these. And just before I do that, I just want to, this presentation is going to be about finance, but there's clearly a very strong moral and ethical argument for getting your investments out of fossil fuels. For pension funds, it does not make any sense why your retirement savings that are theoretically supposed to be there for you when you're 65 or 75 and your family stop working, they should not be invested in companies and projects that are destroying that very future that you're working toward. Same with banks. Why would an RESP for your children or an RRSP for your own funds be invested in these companies that are going to make the earth uninhabitable potentially down the road when you get older? So I just want to really highlight that ethical argument for this. I'm completely on board with it. I hope you are too. But for this conversation, I'm going to stick to the financial arguments for getting out of fossil fuels. And we'll start with physical risk. This is pretty obvious. This is the impacts of all those climate impacts, wildfires, floods, hurricanes, extreme weather, droughts, on physical infrastructure that banks and pension funds invest in or own. So think about like public transit systems, supply chains, ports and airports, entire companies that are disrupted, have their business operations disrupted. I put a couple of examples on here. On the left is the electricity transmission infrastructure in California of Pacific Gas and Electric. In the wildfires a couple of years ago, their grid was entirely destroyed. And they went bankrupt, and they also got charged with manslaughter because so many people died from their infrastructure setting on fire and killing people in those wildfires. So this is just an example of how climate change is providing a direct physical risk to these investments and holdings of these big banks and pension funds. On the right side is the Motiva refinery. It's the biggest refinery on the Gulf Coast in the US for oil and gas. And during Hurricane Harvey in 2017 that slammed the Gulf Coast, it saw all of its storage infrastructure completely flooded, and they had to shut down for months. So just an example of what climate change's impacts is doing to companies directly, just because of the physical dangers that it's bringing. The next one I'm going to talk about is transition risk. And you can think about this in terms of technological disruption. I put some examples up here. Blockbuster movie to Netflix in a very short period of time. The horse and buggy at the beginning of the 20th century being completely replaced by automobiles within 10 to 15 years. And then more recently, digital cameras that some of us might used to have, but now everybody has a camera on their smartphone in their pocket all the time. So these are just examples of companies and industries that were unable to adapt to very disruptive, rapid changes in technology and went into business because of it. And we're starting to see the same trends happening in the energy systems that operate our society. So I'll start with solar as an example. Plummeting costs of solar over the last 20, 30 years. Solar is now the cheapest form of new energy generation in the world in most countries, and that includes cheap gas and oil right now. So, solar is a slam dunk, and it doesn't actually make sense economically to be investing in new fossil fuels because solar is carbon free and it's cheaper. Same thing with battery packs. So these are lithium ion batteries, which obviously go into electric vehicles and are going to be being used for energy storage that are adapted for renewable energy systems. Again, we're seeing this huge downward trend in costs, where it's becoming very economical to invest in renewables and storage or electric vehicles instead of fossil fuel power. A couple headlines just to illustrate what's happening already. We're seeing, oil majors like Exxon just like losing value, having to write down assets. This essentially means that the oil and gas reserves that these companies own are becoming worthless because we know that we can't actually dig them up, refine them, and burn them and stay within our safe climate limits that we know we need to do. This one on the bottom right with BlackRock, that's the biggest asset manager in the world. If they had divested of fossil fuels 10 years ago, they would have been $90 billion richer. So these financial impacts are already here. And if you had a fossil fuel portfolio, you would actually be doing better now than a typical portfolio that you would see in banks in Canada. Moving on to the third category of climate-related risk, and that's like policy and regulatory risks. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with this. These are just actions that governments around the world are taking, including provincially and federally in Canada, to reduce emissions. So now we have carbon pricing in Canada. We're talking about ramping up electric vehicles. We're talking about retrofitting buildings to reduce emissions, get off gas. We're phasing out coal in our electricity grid. We're having regulations across different industrial sectors to reduce emissions, and really just trying to electrify our economy and get off oil and gas within 30 years. So these are, I'll give an example of that. This is countries that are banning the internal combustion engine. We have Norway at the forefront. They're actually going to ban the sale of internal combustion vehicles by 2025. We have a bunch of other countries that are doing it in 2030. Canada's over here in 2040. And we do think that these deadlines for selling gas-powered cars are actually going to move closer to the present. And so just think about what that's going to do to oil and gas demand when entire countries' vehicle fleets are no longer burning oil and running off renewable electricity instead. There's no need to invest in new oil production because there won't be any demand for it. So that's just an example of how regulations and government policy is actually accelerating the shift away from fossil fuels. Related to that is legal and reputational risks. So some of you may see that there are a lot of lawsuits directed at fossil fuel companies now. These are coming from cities, from municipalities, from federal governments, from indigenous groups, from environmental groups, from youth. They're actually suing big oil and gas companies for the cost of climate damage that they're bringing to society. And they're starting to win. So not only is this taking away from the bottom line of these oil and gas companies, but they're being held responsible, and it's actually hurting their social license to operate. So in the process of these lawsuits, you're taking away the reputation of these oil and gas companies to continue functioning in our society. And it's resulting in a lot of delays, cost overruns, public backlash, political opposition to any new fossil fuel infrastructure being built. A lot of you folks are from BC. Just think about what happened to any pipeline that they try to build through BC, like Northern Gateway or Trans Mountain expansion right now. It faces intransigent opposition, cost overruns, delays, and this just causes the cost of building the infrastructure to increase, and it scares investors away because they know that they're not going to be able to get their projects built anymore. So we really need to consider this reputational and legal risk to what's happening to fossil fuel companies and what they're going to be worth 10, 20, 30 years from now when they can't even get their expansion projects built. To me, it looks a lot like these companies are like big tobacco was in the 90s. Tobacco companies ended up having to pay governments billions and billions of dollars because of the health impacts of the products they sold. And the same thing is happening with fossil fuels now. They're being held accountable for the damages they've caused to society. This final bucket is a little bit newer, but I'm going to talk about it, especially in terms of pension funds, because these are long-term investments that are supposed to be there for you 50, 60 years down the road. And that's systemic risk. And that's if we do really start seeing these worst case climate scenarios where you have disruptions of food systems, sea level rise, mass migrations, all kinds of really horrible damages that might make the earth uninhabitable if we don't get this emission trajectory in the right way, you're actually cutting into GDP growth. So it's dependent on economic growth for these pension funds to continue growing. And if you have a constant climate emergency cutting into GDP growth, then you can't actually grow your investments. A good example is, like in this diagram here, the Australian wildfires from 2 Christmases ago. It basically shut down all of southeastern Australia for a month because the cities and towns were just choking on smoke, and the economy couldn't operate. So what impact does that have on the broader financial system, on the broader economics of how our society functions? And it just means that it's impossible for investment to grow or for the economy to grow because of how dysfunctional the climate has become. So if you don't get a handle on the climate change crisis and start driving those emissions down, we will see a future where investments become worthless because society will not be able to operate anymore. And that's kind of a worst case scenario, but that is a systemic risk that long-term investors like pension funds need to keep in mind. And it's already starting to happen. I put some headlines here that kind of shows that climate change and its impacts are already starting to make a dent into GDP growth. And that in the long term, it could really start sinking economies and costing us wealth essentially. On the flip side, this is kind of a grim conversation so far for a Tuesday night, but there is an opportunity side here and there's a way out of this. And that's investing in the solutions to climate change, renewable energy, clean technology, green buildings, retrofits, all kinds of technological solutions that we know how to do and we just need to deploy on a mass scale. We need to start shifting all of these billions of dollars of investments from banks and pension funds into, if we do want to really get onto that downward curve of that line on that graph I showed you before, it's going to require trillions of dollars of investment. And a good place to start would be our own personal investments and our pension fund investments that are supposed to be there for us when we retire. This is an example. This is a graph showing the S&P 500 over the last 10 years. The S&P 500 is a US stock exchange that includes the largest 500 publicly traded companies. So you can see there's information technology, different kinds of industrials. The red line at the bottom here is energy. And in this 10-year period, all of that energy is oil and gas with a little bit of coal in there. So you can see that already over the last 10 years, oil and gas is performing poorly. It grew by just 6%, where the rest of the S&P 500 without oil and gas grew by almost 200%. So again, just going back to, if you had chosen to divest back in 2010, you'd be doing a lot better in your investments than you are now. Same with this, I'll just show this graph. The top line are some energy utilities in Europe that chose to go all in on renewables and phase out their coal plants and shift away from gas and build wind and solar instead, starting 5 or 6 years ago. And you can see that their valuation has gone way up, while these other companies on the bottom here chose to remain invested in volatile oil, gas, and coal, and they have not grown. So we're starting to see that huge gap growing in people's finances with this. And this all goes to really what's happening across the financial world. We're seeing this massive disruption to the way our economy has operated for the last couple of centuries since we started burning fossil fuels. And this combination of public pressure, changing technologies, litigation, and new regulations is really pushing investments away from fossil fuels. And all of these big pension funds, asset managers, banks are starting to recognize it, and we just need to push them along and make sure they start shifting away from fossil fuels faster. This slide is a letter from Larry Fink from BlackRock. That's the biggest asset manager in the world. They have about $9 trillion in assets under management. They're now saying that climate risk is the biggest risk to the financial system and to their clients' investments. So they're starting to pile on and say, we're going to divest from companies that don't fit with a Paris-aligned, safe climate future. I'm going to shift to pensions. The work I do is really focused on pensions. I'll talk a bit about banks before, but these are the 10 largest Canadian public pension funds. There's a couple, most are in Ontario, but there's also BCIMC for BC's public sector and AIMCO in Alberta. There's a Canada pension plan here, which I mentioned that all Canadians pay into except for those in Quebec, because Quebecers pay into the Caisse de dépôt et placement, which is the manager of the Quebec pension plan. And these are together about $1.8 trillion under management. So a huge pool of capital that has real influence around the economy. They're globally respected. They're separately managed from politics. They're professionally managed by a bunch of investors. And they have, like I said, a really huge influence on what gets built and what companies flourish and don't. And of course, these are all contributions from public sector workers who have wages from every paycheck go into these funds. And that is matched by our provincial and federal governments. So there's actually a public taxpayer element to this as well, because the employers that are paying to these funds are government departments, cities, provincial ministries, etc. So it's your and my money. Even if we're not part of these pension funds, our money is still going into them through the employer on the government side. And I'll get into a bit of a deep dive on Cppib Investments, which is the Canada Pension Plan. It's the biggest in Canada. Every Canadian outside of Quebec on every paycheck has a section of their paycheck going to this fund. It's about $456 billion in assets as of September. Just to put that into perspective, that's the same as the GDP of a country like Nigeria or Austria or Iran. That's how big this pension fund is now. And they actually own large parts of the real physical economy. So they own like ports and airports, they own electrical utilities, they own water utilities, they own highways and toll roads, entire blocks of downtown real estate in Toronto and other financial capitals, malls, healthcare providers, oil and gas companies. They actually have the capital to buy and sell entire companies and make or break whether those companies succeed or fail. And that means they have massive influence to shape the economy, which is why the work I do focuses on them. A bit of the good that they're doing. So they actually are considering environmental, social, and governance factors across all their investments now. It's a step in the right direction. They're a founding member of something called the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. So that's a international body that's encouraging companies and investors to start reporting annually on those financial risks of climate change that I went through earlier in this presentation. They've embedded climate change across their governance structures. They have a bunch of committees and executives and internal processes to start tracking climate change risks of their portfolio. They're actually measuring the carbon footprints of their portfolio now, and they're also assessing the impact of climate change in different scenarios, whether it's a 1.5 degree world or a 2 degree world or a 4 degree world on their portfolios. So they're starting to consider the risk of climate change and what impact it will have on their investments. And finally, they actually are making a big move into renewable energy. In 2019, we saw them put 1 billion euros into a green bond to fund renewable energy in Europe. They bought a huge company called Pattern Energy for about $2.3 billion in 2020. It's one of the biggest wind developers in North America. And just a couple of months ago, they launched their own renewable energy platform that will allow them to accelerate renewable energy investments in the future. And I'll show this graph. This is from their last annual report. You can see down in 2016, they had almost nothing invested in renewable energy. By 2020, it was up to 6.6 billion, and it's actually now up to 9 billion. So the Canada Pension Plan actually has recognized that renewables and clean technology are a huge investing opportunity and are starting to move their money into it. But unfortunately, it's not fast enough. So for one thing, we don't really have a lot of transparency and disclosure. Considering you and I are all members of this pension fund, and I spend my day sifting through these reports to find out what they're investing in, I can't actually tell you how much is invested in fossil fuels because they're not transparent about it. It's also unclear to us how all these internal tools and processes they have are actually influencing their decision-making and why it's not telling them to get out of fossil fuels. We're estimating on the very conservative side that they have about $12 billion invested in fossil fuel companies. This includes the gamut of coal, oil sands, oil and gas majors, pipeline networks, refineries. They're a pretty oily pension fund, unfortunately. And we're actually seeing the negative impacts of that. So in their last annual reports, even though they weathered the COVID pandemic quite well and the economic crisis that followed, the worst performing part of their portfolio was their energy and resources portfolio, which is full of fossil fuels. It declined by 23.4% between 2019 and 2020. So we're actually seeing in real time the negative impacts of these investments in fossil fuels. The really ugly stuff, I'll give a couple examples in the next two slides about some particularly troublesome investments they have. It came out this year, they have $141 million invested in Chinese coal. I don't know why we would want our pension fund invested in coal companies in China. Their investments are completely out of step with the Paris Agreement, as well as Canada's own climate commitments. We're trying to reduce our emissions nationwide by 30% below 1990 levels by 2030. And there's no way that Canada Pension Plan's investments are aligned with that target. They're quite intransigent on the climate and fossil fuel divestments discussion, even though a lot of pension funds around the world are starting to actively get rid of their fossil fuel holdings. CPP is doubling down on fossil fuels and still expanding them. And finally, the CPP is governed by a piece of federal legislation called the Cppib Act, and it's really difficult to amend. It basically requires the consent of 7 provinces representing 2/3 of Canada's population. So to try and amend this legislation to improve climate risk disclosure and analysis would be the equivalent of trying to change Canada's constitution. So it's really difficult to do that from somebody who's interested in government change or campaigning like I am in the work that Shift does. Those 2 really bad examples I'll go over quickly. The first is Creston Peak Resources. So this is a fracking company based in Denver that the CPP bought in 2015. The fund managers that oversaw the transaction then went to sit on Creston's board and executive team, and they're still sitting there now. What did this company do? They started massively expanding fracking in Colorado. What did it lead to? This massive influx of complaints to Colorado's oil and gas regulator about breathing-related illnesses, asthma attacks, poor air quality, toxic fume releases. There was earthquakes. There was worker injuries. This was one of the least popular companies in Colorado. People absolutely couldn't stand them. They were drilling next to schools and playgrounds, and it prompted a lot of local communities to put a moratorium on new fracking wells in their counties. They tried to extend that fracking moratorium statewide the following year. And so instead of cleaning up its acts, Creston, which is wholly owned by the Canada Pension Plan, decided to instead start plowing money into state elections. So in the 2018 Colorado state elections, this company that's funded by the CPP and our pension funds poured about $600,000 US into pro-fracking Republican candidates and super PACs that were trying to expand fracking in the state. So this is a really problematic investment that came out in the media in September that really a lot of Canadians are not comfortable with, not just because of the climate impacts, but also because of the impacts to human health and just the ethical problems of what they're doing with our pension savings. The other example I'll give is a company called Nephin Energy. This is a wholly owned CPP subsidiary that made a 830 million euro investment in some offshore gas reserves off the coast of Ireland back in 2018. They bought it from Shell, actually. Nephin is now Ireland's biggest producer of natural gas, which means that our pension fund is tied up in the interest of expanding gas production. This was very controversial in Ireland, and there's now a very powerful movement that has forced the government in Ireland, the new government incoming, to actually ban new oil and gas offshore drilling off the coast of the country. So I think this is a good thing, but unfortunately it means that this investment that the Canada Pension Plan made can't grow because they're legislatively not allowed to in Ireland. So this investment and all the gas reserves that came up with it are essentially unextractable and unburnable. And I think this really highlights some of that regulatory risk that I talked about in this presentation. This is a real-time example of that happening with our own pension savings. This is kind of long to read, but we have been trying to get the CPP to move away from fossil fuels, and they've been quite intransigent. If you have time to read some of these quotes, they seem to think that oil and gas company is going to be part of the solution, that they're going to magically shift to lower carbon energy sources over time, and that it's in their interest not to divest, even if these investments have no prospects for growth. So they've been really opposed to any kind of movements on setting policies to shift away from fossil fuels or align their portfolio with the Paris agreements. And it's going to take a lot more public pressure to get them to do so. And we think that there actually is an opening, even though they say they're immune to politics and public pressure. Some of you guys might remember the story from a couple of years ago, and it was happening when the Trump administration was detaining migrant families along the US-Mexico border, and it came out that they were detaining children in cages. And the companies that were doing this, Geo Group and Core Civic, two American private prison companies, were held, their shares were held by the Canada Pension Plan. This came out in the news, there was widespread public outrage, and within weeks, we saw Canada Pension Plan divested these two private prison companies. And we think that really kind of sets a precedence to say that they actually are not immune to public pressure and will bend to a lot of Canadians speaking out with outrage about what some of the things they're investing in. So I just wanted to kind of highlight an example of ways that we can potentially influence this massive pension fund. What are we doing at Shift? So I'll share some links after, but if you go to shiftyourpension.ca, it allows you to send an email to your pension fund managers. You can click CPP from the drop-down menu and send one of the Canada Pension Plan, but if you're a member of another pension plan that we work on, you can also select those. You or your parents or family members or friends, they might be members of these other pension funds. I'm not, but a lot of people are. So we had this tool that kind of acts like any petition that goes to a councillor or an MP, but it goes to pension fund managers instead. We've been meeting with CPP staff to try and get this message across. I do a lot of ongoing monitoring of CPP's energy investments, as well as investments in climate solutions. We have a climate action toolkit that kind of pulls together all this information I'm sharing about the CPP. Last year in October, the CPP is required to hold these public consultations that are legislatively mandated. And we made an effort to drive thousands of Canadians to show up to these. And we did see that climate change and fossil fuel investments were the #1 issue that came up in questions during those public meetings. We're doing a lot of media work to raise the profile of these risky fossil fuel investments and why they're so problematic. And we also produced a video about Creston Peak Resources with our allies in Colorado about what they're doing to that community. This is some of the media we've done, some of the headlines that we're doing to spread the word about what Canada Pension Plan is up to. And I don't think I have time to show this video from Colorado, but I can share it in the links later on if folks are interested. And I'll just note that, oops, I don't want to start that. There we go. So if you go to shiftyourpension.ca, you can send a message to your pension fund managers. And I'll just note that if folks are in Alberta or in Ontario or BC or elsewhere across the country, I'd be happy to share similar information as we have about the CPP about pension funds in your province as well. I'm going to shift a bit to banks, a few slides on banks. So this is a report from a group called Bank Track and the Rainforest Action Network. And they've basically assessed the financial services that big banks have supplied to fossil fuel companies since the Paris Agreement was signed in November 2015. So starting in January 2016 till about midway through 2019, they've actually tracked all of the loans, credits, underwriting, financial services, shareholding that these banks have provided to fossil fuel companies and added them all up. And sure enough, we see on this all 5 big banks in Canada: RBC, TD, Scotiabank, Bank of Montreal, CIBC. So these are really some of the biggest financiers of new fossil fuel infrastructure and companies in the world. Between that 2016 and 19 time period, we saw almost $500 billion US from these 5 Canadian banks flowing into fossil fuels. So they're, like I said before, what gets financed, what gets built, and these banks have a huge role to play in whether we make it out of the climate crisis or not. To put this kind of in a more tangible message, as far as project financing, you guys might have heard of the Line 3 tar sands pipeline that they're trying to build from Alberta across a couple states and provinces to the western shores of Lake Superior. It's being fought by environmentalists and landowners and indigenous groups in the US right now, and they're calling on President Biden to revoke its permit and not let the project get built. And if you look at who's financing the project, it's right there. The big 5 Canadian banks that are just pouring billions of dollars into Enbridge the company behind this company, or the company behind this project, in order to expand fossil fuel infrastructure. Another example, you guys might remember last year before the pandemic, there was blockades all across the country to stand in solidarity with the Wet'suwet'en in northern BC that are trying to prevent the Coastal GasLink pipeline from being built from gas fields in northeastern BC and Alberta to the BC coast at Kitimat. And again, we see the big five banks pouring millions of dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars into TC Energy, the company behind the pipeline. And just to go back to pensions for a second, you'll see on this chart, AIMCO, which is the pension fund manager for Alberta's big public pension funds, they actually bought the pipeline in December 2019. So they bought a 65% stake in this pipeline, which means they clearly have an interest in seeing it get built and operate for its entire lifespan. Like I said, I don't work directly on banks, although I do think that there will be a lot more environmental campaigning coming to Canada on banks in the near future. There's a group called the Climate Pledge Collective that has a bank switch campaign, and they provide resources on how you begin to approach your bank managers and your local branches and start this conversation. I'll share more resources about this in a follow-up email. But it just basically means, start out with a letter or a friendly conversation with your branch managers, explain your problem with where they're investing your money, and kind of say, I'm going to change banks if you don't put in place better climate policies. Do some research on the alternatives. In BC, Van City is a completely fossil-free bank. Desjardins has really strong climate policies. They're based in Quebec, but have services across Canada. Basically, your local credit union is pretty good. I have my money with a credit union based in Toronto. Alterna, Meridian in Ontario. I'm not sure about the credit unions out west, but a lot of them have pretty strong fossil fuel exclusionary policies. And then just follow up and kind of keep having that conversation with the bank. And if they don't actually move your money away from fossil fuels, then pull your accounts and put it somewhere else. And I'm not sure if folks have a mortgage, but interest rates are pretty low. Obviously, mortgages are a huge source of profit for a lot of banks. You can say, I'm going to bring my mortgage to another institution that doesn't invest in fossil fuels. So those are some of the tactics that are going to be coming to Canada to try and apply pressure on these banks to get into fossil fuels. And I'll end off with this slide. Greg kind of mentioned this before, but it just kind of gets across the impact you can have as an individual by getting your finances out of fossil fuels. On the left here, obviously these are good things. You can, try to use less electricity at home, or maybe take less flights every year, or start buying using electric car instead of your gas fuel car, or become a vegetarian. I kind of try to make these personal changes in my life to try and reduce my own personal carbon footprints. But you can see that there's a much bigger emissions reduction impact by moving your money out of fossil fuels than just those small personal changes you can make in your life. So I just kind of wanted to show this graph to get across why we're doing the work that we do and why it's so important to start having these conversations with pension funds and banks and start moving these massive pools of capital away from fossil fuels and into greener climate solutions. I'll leave it at that. It's 9:15, so we got some good time for Q&A. And yeah, happy to have a good discussion and talk more about some of the resources I talked about.
Patrick, that was amazing. Well done. You didn't even drink any water or anything. Yeah, I honestly, there's some serious nefarious stuff going on there with the CPP that definitely makes me question it all. My wife is a teacher, so she's on the BC pension. So I'm looking forward to checking into if it's the BC IMC you mentioned.
Yep, it is.
But yeah, I'll take a look at all that. It really, especially like I said, that last slide, the slide we're on right now. I mean, that thing it really kind of blows my mind. Where you're like, oh my God, that can do huge impact here just by being with the right banks and having the right portfolio. Yeah, thanks a ton. I'm sure.
I definitely can share. I assume there's lots of folks in the call from BC, and BCI manages the pension funds for all the teachers in BC, all of the municipal employees across the province, all the provincial employees across the province, as well as BC Hydro and WorkSafe BC. So it's a really big fund. It's about $150 billion. And we see similar patterns as a CPP with BCI, huge investments in big polluters and particularly fracking companies, because fracking is such a big industry out west in BC.
Yeah, I didn't even want to look at those slides you had. So in my case with my wife, like what would be my best option here? Like what should we do?
Yeah, so I mean, the
Because
first
I
step
want her
is,
pension. I mean, we want her pension to last and we want it to be great. So
yeah. So the first step is to, I'm not trying to plug my own work here, but to sign that action tool, you can send a letter to BCI managers right away. That allows us to stay in contact with you and kind of do an escalating series of tactics. So we're doing stuff like getting folks to attend BCI managed pension funds annual general meetings and start asking really difficult questions about their investments in fossil fuels and their approach to climate risk. We're doing a lot of media work to raise the profile of the issue of what BCI is invested in. We've been scheduling direct meetings between pension fund beneficiaries and the pension funds themselves so that they can actually hear from the members of these plans. And we're also trying to get folks like, the teachers unions or public sector unions or, the different groups whose members pay into these funds to start doing the similar kind of advocacy that we're doing. We want to kind of build a movement of people that are demanding change. And part of that is just having conversations like this. And we're happy to kind of deliver more workshops like this that are targeted to a specific beneficiary group about a specific pension fund.
So even Annika's here, she's just asking, like, so like all of us, our checks go to CPP, but do we have any options with that, or it's the same thing? We should just go onto your website and just send some letters in to start creating change internally, because we
Yeah,
don't have a choice, right? We don't. I mean, obviously, we don't want to be supporting those frackings in Colorado, and but we already are. So
yeah. Unfortunately, we don't have a choice. Like it's mandatory to pay into the Canada Pension Plan. Their management is quite insulated from politics. So they're, like I said, they're very nauseous about bending to the will of anybody trying to tell them how to invest their money. And that's why I think that, like I did in this presentation, we really need to make the financial arguments. These folks on Bay Street that manage these funds, they're not going to care about the ethical arguments. We need to really draw out the financial risk arguments in those financial circles to try and evoke change.
well, exactly. Stan here, he just mentions something that the Wealthsimple has a socially responsible investment portfolio that outperformed the regular one last year. So
yeah.
I mean, just for them to see positive numbers is going to help fuel change. Again, money is going to fuel change.
For sure. One of the things we're actually asking for as well, and this is happening with pension funds in the US, UK, and Europe, is they're actually starting to offer, like Wealthsimple does, an option to their members to put their retirement savings into a fossil-free portfolio or some other kind of responsible investing portfolio that excludes fossil fuels. And we want to start seeing Canadian pension funds do the same. The one that's probably most ahead right now is the Caisse de dépôt, which manages the Quebec pension plan. They actually have set targets to reduce the carbon intensity of their portfolio. They've set targets to increase their investments in climate solutions. And they've actually attached their executive compensation to emissions reductions. So we are seeing a crack in the door opening for these Canadian pension funds. Ontario Teachers is another one. They just announced a net zero emissions target by 2050 last month. So we're just trying to ramp up the pressure and get more people involved to start calling on their funds for these moves into climate action.
So yeah, just reading some of the comments here. There's definitely, I mean, some big impact for all of us if we can start making these changes. But yeah, reading Andriane, do you see the comments on the side? Oh, there we go. Just the financial advisor at Scotia just basically told her to disassociate her personal beliefs if she wants a safe, good portfolio. It's stuff's intimidating. Anybody else have any good questions for Patrick here?
Yeah, I mean, one of the resources we can provide is, some of the stuff I shared in this presentation is there's just very clear financial evidence now that funds that are fossil free are outperforming those with fossil fuels in them. And we're going to see this trend accelerate. Like I said, those slides that show all of these reserves being written down, all of these fracking companies going bankrupt, all these oil and gas majors that are losing market cap and valuation. This trend's only going to accelerate as government policy becomes stronger and folks like you start demanding change. So it really is the sooner the better that we move these funds out of fossil fuels, the better off we are for the climate and for our own pocketbooks.
I mean, that's the problem with a lot of this too, is we want our pocketbooks to make sense, right?
Yeah.
As much as we all care about the future of the world, we also care about our own futures. So to have them both kind of coexist together would be the dream.
I don't know if you want me to like address the questions in the chat or yeah. Okay. I'm just seeing this question from Zach. For managing your own pension, like if you're a public sector employee that are a member of these funds, you don't really have that option. Like you have to have your funds managed by these asset managers. But if you have your own, RSPs or TFAs or whatever your own investments are, there are some good options now. Like I said, the credit unions are a good place to start. And I should be clear, I'm not a financial advisor, so I don't want to start providing all kinds of financial advice, but there's a guy in Toronto named Tim Nash who has a company called Good Investing. And what he'll do is actually meet with you for an hour and talk to you about what you want to see your money doing. It might be you don't want your money invested in weapons companies or alcohol or meat companies, for example. And he'll actually recommend different ETFs and financial products for you that's both cool and with values. So I definitely advise looking into to them. The other option is Genus Capital Management, which is based in Vancouver. They have a bunch of, they're a fossil-free investing firm. So them and Van City would be good examples for folks out west.
Ethic Invest on the West Coast as well. Paul Wright has a question there right near the end. Can you see if you can address that one? It's kind of a tough one. Vancouver was Genus Capital, right?
Yeah, Genus Capital, yeah.
Yeah. Can you hear me, Greg?
Yeah.
Yeah. So the question to you, Patrick, was when you start doing your own portfolio and years ago you put all effort into stocks like Ballard and Tesla and say fuel cell energy, but then suddenly you start digging into them and there's a pretty big carbon footprint in investing in Ballard and investing in Tesla. And what's the best way when you have these quote, low carbon endpoints, but they use a lot of carbon in order to get to the production of their products and building their batteries? And what's your advice on that?
Yeah, I mean, at this point, it's probably impossible to completely decarbonize industrial processes. Like a good example is like cement, or for Tesla, like the machines that are being built that are being used to build Tesla's facilities are going to be fossil fuel powered. So I mean, I think it's probably impossible to completely. I think fossil fuels now usually have a screen where if a company generates, say, more than 5% of the revenue or 5% of their reserves come from coal, oil, or gas, then they'll be screened out of that portfolio. You could also kind of like have a renewable energy fund. So on the positive side, you could say this ETF is only invested in renewable energy companies that have no gas or oil in their portfolio. It's a little bit tricky now because a lot of utilities, electric utilities, for example, are starting to transition away from coal and gas. So in Alberta, for example, we're seeing all the utilities phase out coal by 2023. But in some cases, they're shifting into gas instead. We would argue that it needs to go completely into renewables. So in the utility sector, you got to be really careful about looking these are pure renewables, or if they have a bunch of gas in their portfolio still as well. And it's really tricky. A lot of times these fossil-free funds as well, I'll just put this in there, is they end up accounting for that lack of investing in energy by putting a lot of money into information technology companies. So Facebook, Amazon, Twitter, which come along with their own set of ethical problems. So I would just be, really careful about expecting your portfolio to be completely squeaky clean across all these different responsible investing areas.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's much like all of this. It's progress, not perfection. We're definitely,
yeah.
It's hard to find perfection out there.
Patrick, on your very last slide where you showed the footprint, the data supports what you're proposing, except I just want to contrast that. I can go after influencing my bank and pension, okay, but I think the other side of the coin is I can go after getting off of fossil fuels in my house and moving to heat pumps, for example, for my hot water and for my heating, and then looking at solar panels, and I actually think that I can have a pretty if enough of us do it at the community levels and start demanding the technology and the solutions. I'm not sure if your graph is telling the whole story. Like what I'm trying to say is that if we can if we can demand at the grassroots level solutions that aren't using fossil fuels, it will influence where it'll basically influence our economy to get off of fossil fuels. If that, and I think your chart is saying, I think what you're trying to emphasize is the biggest bang for the buck is through influencing investors. But what about at the grassroots level?
No, I don't want to diminish the other actions you can take. I think they're all really important, including what you're talking about, where there actually is a really big emissions reductions change if you were getting an entire community or an entire city investing in those solutions. So I don't think that they're mutually exclusive. We should be doing all of it. And just to your point, I really want to emphasize not just the fossil fuel divestment side of this conversation, but the reinvestment side. So when these big funds move our money out of fossil fuels, we actually want them to go directly into the solutions. And some ideas for that are emerging could actually be financing this transition you're talking about at the community level. We've been having some discussions about OMERS, which is the big municipal employees retirement plan in Ontario. And there's a lot of potential for a regional fund like that to invest in climate solutions at the community or provincial level. So maybe they want to deploy a whole range of district energy heating to communities across the province, or maybe they want to create a financial product that has a bunch of houses and buildings get off gas. And it would be the pension fund that provides the financing in order to achieve those outcomes at scale. A lot of this is really in the nation stages, but it is kind of creative thinking that we have to start doing to get out of this crisis. And I'll just note that none of these funds, except for the Quebec pension plan, has a mandate to invest in economic development. So all these funds, their sole mandate is to maximize returns for their beneficiaries. Some funds outside of Canada, as well as, like I mentioned, Quebec, they have a dual mandate to maximize returns, but also to invest in regional economic development. So it provides another avenue for making an argument that we should be reinvesting in our own communities to benefit the members of the funds, and not buying a fracking company in Colorado or an airport in the UK, that they actually have a mandate to invest in their communities that they serve.
And is one, like going back to your OMERS example, isn't green bonds one way to do that? Like you basically demand that your banks or your government are issuing green bonds, and with the proceeds, some of the proceeds are being used to do what you just said, basically financing communities or cities or individuals to get off of fossil fuels.
Yeah, absolutely. Green bonds are actually a good solution. Yeah, and some of the pension funds like Cppib and Ontario Teachers have already invested in green bonds. So yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah, I agree with you, Alex, too, is that it's the changes have to happen on the individual side and also the bank side. And I mean, his graph definitely shows that the banks are very effective, but I agree that the demand also has to come from our side for the advancements in solar panel. That there's one question there that would be good to answer for you, Patrick, from Annika. Just curious if you can see that one. 625 is when she posted it. I think that'd be a good one to kind of answer because it is tough to figure out what she.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, obviously the divestment movement is not just in pension funds and banks, but it's also spread to municipalities, to universities. So I do think that this kind of financial risk argument can be applied to, any community that has an endowment fund or a municipal funds, or some kind of joint community fund that can be shifted to invest in community and get rid of fossil fuels. We are looking at one of the tactics that we're thinking about deploying is for funds like BC's municipal pension plan, which is managed by VCI, or OMERS in Ontario, in a whole bunch of cities that already declared to pass resolutions through the councils calling on that municipal pension plan to divest. And when you have tens or hundreds of municipalities and cities saying that and making that argument, then it definitely applies a lot of pressure to the funds themselves to move forward with it. I think it'll be particularly effective in BC because we've already seen cities like Vancouver and Victoria divest their city funds, and it's a natural extension to get their pension fund to do the same thing.
Yeah, I think a lot of this, as I was just looking too, you said the CPP has 2% in green energy. They're up to 9 or whatever. I mean, we just want to get that to 50% to 100% eventually, right? Like 2% is such a drop in the bucket.
Yeah.
I'll answer one or two more questions, and then we'll continue this discussion elsewhere. I think what's great is Patrick is going to share us. Well, he already has his website actions we can all take.
Yeah, I see this question from Annika. I'm not sure exactly what the question, but there are some big private sector funds. So an example would be Canada Post has a big pension fund. Air Canada and Bell and Rogers have big private pension funds. Like the doctors have a big pension fund. There are a bunch of like other private sector funds that are not as big as the public sector ones, but are still billions or tens of billions of dollars. And I think that's the same kind of strategies that we're talking about here with the public sector pension funds could definitely be applied to individual companies and private funds. And one of the things that might work with that is if the company itself has a climate policy, if they're trying to reduce their emissions intensity or increase waste diversion or trying to get their own employees to do better on the environment, then that actually acts as a hook to say, well, if we're doing these things as a company, then let's try to make our pension fund clean as well. So I do think that these kind of tactics can be applied to smaller private sector funds and individual companies. Annika.
Awesome. Well, Patrick, thanks a ton again. That was fantastic. If anybody has any questions, should they email you or?
Yeah, you can reach me at patrick@shiftaction.ca. And like I said, I'll share with Izzy and Greg a bunch of the resources I talked about today and some guides to what you can do.
Yeah, I gotta say, I mean, the finances, you're like, oh, this is super interesting. I definitely feel like there's some huge actions we can all take here. There's another thing, that we never touched is the dirty secret of Bitcoins and stuff like that. And somebody in the Facebook page or in the reflections wanted me to talk about it. And Bitcoin's a tough one because it has some great positive aspects, but the energy intensive mining that requires so much electricity, about as much as Ireland right now, is it's a whole another topic that we couldn't get into this month. But yeah, thanks a ton for everyone for joining. Hopefully you learned a lot. Let's keep the discussion going. And like I said at the start, this is all about the tipping point. It's all about us talking, learning, sharing with our friends, because the more of us that know about a bunch of the dirty little secrets that Patrick just showed us, the more of us that question the CPP, that question all our own pensions, question our banks, these are all going to cause the changes we need. Yeah, everybody is loving what you said, Patrick. Thanks a ton. Izzy, do we have any last minute things you want to mention?
No, that's it. Thank you so much, Patrick. Yeah, everyone, thank you so much for coming and being part of this challenge. Feel free to reach out anytime if you have any feedback or questions about the challenge in general. And make sure you're on the Facebook page and contributing to that. I think it's a really good place for us to just connect and build this community of people who want to do better for the environment. So thanks a lot. Thanks, Greg and Patrick. And we'll see you
Thanks for
guys
having me.
next month.
Good night, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah.